Welcome to the Ending Sexploitation podcast, where we decode sexual harm and provide you with active solutions. I'm your host, Kaylee McNamara. Everyone, in this podcast episode, we get to speak with Dawn Hawkins, the newly appointed CEO of the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, a woman I am proud and happy to call my boss and friend, who's been recently promoted from executive director. So Dawn, thank you so much for joining.
Hi, Haley. I love your podcast.
Oh, thank you. Oh, it's been so long since we've been able to chat. So I feel like I just need to schedule podcast interviews whenever we're behind on our meetings. So first, I'd love to really just turn back the clock a little bit from where you are now as the CEO of a national and increasingly international NGO to reflect on how you got here. How did you first become passionate about these sexual exploitation and abuse issues?
Oh, where do I start? It's felt like there's been experience after experience throughout my life of witnessing this injustice of sexual exploitation, all the way starting when I was like in middle school, arriving from the bus and walking up to my big group of guy friends standing in a circle who were talking about the exploitation of one of the young girls in our class and laughing and joking about it, and just feeling this deep sense of injustice at that young age and trying to make sense of it. And that sense of injustice stuck with me. I really got involved, I think, and really much more deliberately when it was about 13 years ago. I was standing on a corner in Kaposvár, Hungary, which is a small little town. And unfortunately, I had just left teaching English. I taught English there. And I had met with a young survivor of sex trafficking. And that was kind of the norm. Those were folks that I met regularly in teaching English. And I was standing on a corner just in disbelief. I had just passed by a group of men who were catcalling and sexually harassing me. And as I stood on the corner, I glanced over and another man was sitting on a bench reading a newspaper with a pornographic ad on the cover. Mm-hmm. And at that moment, I just felt this calling, like, I need to do something about this, having no idea what could be done or that I would have the opportunity to join an incredible organization like Nekozi. But as soon as I could, I looked for an organization doing work on these issues to strike at the systems that facilitate exploitation. And the National Center on Sexual Exploitation was the only one I could find. And I begged them to let me volunteer, and they said yes for a couple of years. And so here I am now, about 13 years later.
I love always asking people that question because so often it's people see something horrific, but they don't let that stop. They go on to take an action. And so I think it's just really inspiring and encouraging to people who are listening that this all started because you started volunteering with this organization. And now here you are 13 years later. And how has Nekozi really evolved over that time?
Oh, good question. Well, so my initial thought was all these issues are connected: the trafficking and prostitution, the violence against women, the pornography. And so I was looking for ways to combat that. When I first found Nekozi, they were originally named Morality and Media at the time. Pornography was their main issue, and they really focused on pornography, and they were going somewhat through a change of talking about pornography from a more moral standpoint, more moral perspective, to one that's really based on research, science, anecdotal evidences. They were doing a lot of research before too, but there was this shift. There was a shift in leadership at the time. The board was changing. Patrick Truman stepped up as president and CEO, and he had this grand vision of uniting everyone who felt a sense of injustice and could see the inequality and the abuses in the pornography industry, whether it was the kind of pro-family type groups or the liberal radical liberal feminists. And he had this idea of we need to unite them. And I came in right at that moment. And so Patrick and I sought to really shift the organization, and it has grown so much, not just the organization, but the movement. So that changed. We changed the messaging to be what the public health impacts are of pornography. We shifted also the messaging to the realities of the connections between sexual abuse and exploitation. And as soon as we started highlighting those connections, it's like so many people had these aha moments. And then the advocacy was just started to be easier. These companies, members of government, suddenly the doors were opening because they could see the connection between pornography and violence against women, or prostitution and sex trafficking. And so, the earlier years while I was here, we were going through that kind of transition from being a single issue organization to all of the exploitation and abuse issues, as well as making sure that this is a big tent. So, there can't just be one particular perspective, one religion, one political ideology, one type of tactic that's deployed to combat these issues. It has to be everyone who shares that sense of human dignity as a right, and we should be protecting it. And so the National Center on Sexual Exploitation expanded. We have grown a diverse staff, a diverse coalition spanning over 600 leaders from many countries, and a diverse set of tactics. So now we're engaged in not only the corporate type advocacy that we were known for a long time, but legislative policy advocacy. We started a law center so we could be a voice in the courts and legislatures. Outside of us, there's no one. There's nobody who is active in our courts and legislatures. And we've really spent a lot of time pouring through the research and combing through and making it available to other allies, to business leaders, to elected officials, to the public. So in short, now the National Center on Sexual Exploitation has a much wider set of issues that they work on. And our tactics have evolved to include coalition building, and then research, litigation, and corporate and legislative advocacy. Long, maybe too long.
Not at all. No, I am obviously biased because I work at Nekozi with you, but I've always thought it's just incredible to see how the vision expanded for the organization. Like you said, so many different tactics, realizing we need diverse and broad coalitions. And I think about that all the time. That seems like the way that you can make any real lasting progress is to get everyone to understand, to recognize the research, the science, the survivors' lived experiences, to actually make something that's going to change permanent. So Haley, I'm a big fan of it.
If I could just say, especially because of the recent opposition, even last night that I got on Twitter, there's like the sex industry lobbyists and their apologists are trying to put us in this really narrow corner where they're saying this is just a conservative, or this is just a religious group, or here's a campaign that they agreed to be a partner on 20 or 30 years ago. And they're trying to define us that way and to try to discredit us, but it's such a lie. I mean, we have such a diverse staff and a diverse board. We have key leaders from the conservative, from the right, and from the left. And all of their reasons for being here, they span women's injustice issues, family reasons, just a whole bunch, race issues, LGBT issues. Like, that's why so many different people are here. We come from so many different perspectives, and that's what makes up Nekozi. So these like pretty lame efforts to try to discredit us by just flat out lying or using things from 30 years ago, everyone can just ignore that.
Well, that transitions perfectly into a couple of the next questions, because there have been some questions about Nekozi. I think some confusion about the nature and mission of the organization. One often stems back to, like you said, the original name of the organization right when you joined was morality in media, and they were coming at it from a bit more of a moralist perspective and founded by interfaith leaders. So is Nekozi as it exists now a religious organization, or how does that take a part in the company's or organization's current identity?
Thank you. I'm so grateful to stand on the backs of these incredible, our founders and those who carried the torch on these issues before me. The word morality actually seemed to have a different meaning in 1962 when we started than it did even when I came on board in around 2010, in general society. The short answer is no, the National Center on Sexual Exploitation is not a religious organization. We're non-sectarian. Yes, a number of our staff come with a passionate spiritual reason for why they're here, but it's not everybody, and it's not just why we do as an organization what we do. It's because there is right and wrong. There is morality involved in this, and it is wrong to exploit people and to make money off of their exploitation and their abuse, even adding to that. And so we stand fighting for right and for truth on their behalf.
And would you characterize Nekozi as aligning with any particular political group or partisan leaning, either as a liberal organization or a conservative organization?
Definitely not. I mean, if you even just look at the legislation that we have passed and are supporting, it is completely bipartisan. There is not a single piece of legislation that we've endorsed in recent years that is only one way. And that's because that's the only way to see success and progress. And because exploitation and abuse it touches everybody. It doesn't matter what political party you're affiliated with. And so it's problematic to say that only the Republicans or only the Democrats have the answer to this. And the most amazing thing, Haley, is that amid all the division in our country politically, this is an issue that unites mostly and brings us together. So at least I don't feel like I have that, that outside drama of politics, because in our world, day to day, it's a lot of unity.
That actually gives me so much hope too, because I think there's so much that people can fight about on Capitol Hill. Nekozi's based in Washington, D.C., and you can there's always something to fight about politically. But like you said, sexual exploitation and abuse shouldn't be on that list. And for the most part, it's not really. It is amazing to see how legislators can realize that there's a bipartisan need to unite on those issues. So I'm glad that Nekozi stands in that place. Another thing that I think makes Nekozi quite unique is its scope and its focus on a wide variety of sexual exploitation and abuse issues. For people who have been following us for a long time, maybe on our website, you've seen we have a web graphic that shows, it's like a spider web with all these different names of different sexual harms and showing how they're connected. And so we work on everything from sex trafficking and child sexual abuse to more controversial issues sometimes, like pornography and prostitution. Pretty much everyone can agree that sex trafficking and child sex abuse is harmful and bad, but there's more debate around things like pornography and prostitution. So why do you think it's important for Nekozi to be addressing those issues instead of just focusing on the ones that everyone kind of already agrees on?
Well, this is complicated. These issues are complicated. If we want to end sex trafficking, which is kind of the buzzword that so many people are interested in, well, you have to address prostitution, because sex trafficking does not exist outside of the prostitution marketplace. Those individuals, mostly men, almost all men, who go out and purchase somebody for sex, they're not thinking usually, I want to go get someone who's sex trafficked. No, they're saying, I want to go to someone in prostitution. But in order to fill the demand, to keep up with all of those men who think it's okay to buy somebody for sex, pimps and traffickers have to get more into the supply chain, more women, more children, more vulnerable individuals into the supply chain to meet that demand. And so the only way to combat sex trafficking is to recognize how it happens within the prostitution marketplace and to curb the demand, quite frankly, to stop the sex buying behavior. When you think of pornography, I can talk about this for so long, Haley. So just
it's all good.
Rein me in if you need to, but like just an example about pornography. If I think overall, since Me Too erupted, almost everyone is in complete agreement that sexual violence against women is awful and it needs to be fixed. Well, how do we fix it? Yes, teaching consent and making sure that consent is given is a key piece of that. And that's largely been the dialogue of how we fix this problem. But also the recognizing the role pornography plays. If our young men and our young women are watching hardcore violent pornography, where almost always the women depicted are the victims or the recipients of extreme aggression, even when they say no in the pornography, and which is almost all the porn out there, then what is that teaching them? How do we expect our young people to go into the world and think, yeah, it's not okay to just touch somebody or to say these nasty words or to expect this kind of behavior from their girlfriends and boyfriends too. And so, if we want to curb violence against women or sexual violence, you have to address the role pornography is playing in setting sexual templates and shaping the attitudes of our young people and older people too. Mm-hmm. So that being said, I think what makes us unique is that we are willing to talk about these tough issues that others that are controversial, but they're the root of so many of these other harms. And if you just skirt over them, well, we're going to continue to have extreme violence against women. We're going to continue to have child sexual abuse. We're going to continue to have sex trafficking.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I really like what you said about we're trying to get to the root. And so many of these issues, like you said, things like sex trafficking or child sexual abuse are often downstream from issues like prostitution or pornography or intersecting in so many ways. Another example that just comes to mind, of course, is over this last year, all of the revelations that came out about Pornhub, one of the most mainstream, large, supposedly legitimate pornography websites in the world. And it was found to be rife with child sexual abuse images, sex trafficked videos, and other non-consensually recorded and shared content. And, we have to address that. And just because it's happening on a pornography website doesn't mean it suddenly gets a free pass. We have to really confront abuse and exploitation wherever it happens.
Exactly. That's such a good example. And we're seeing it play out on the public stage now as more and more of these abuses are coming to light. I mean, I think there's 8 lawsuits right now against the pornography industry, representing hundreds, probably thousands of victims whose abuse material was uploaded. The reality is that the pornography industry and the prostitution trafficking industry have merged completely online. There is no difference online. And that's the different world that we live in today than we did 20 years ago.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point, because the way that sex trafficking or prostitution even is advertised online is often through pornography, or that's used to extort someone into offline abuse or offline exploitation. Yeah, I really do think the rise of the internet has definitely made all of these issues, which were connected before anyway, but now it's like they're hand in glove. It's
like the same industry. It is the same industry largely. Increasingly, we're seeing, just adding to that, the example of pornography and prostitution trafficking, so many prostitution victims are being filmed and photographed. When I say prostitution victims, I also mean sex trafficking victims. They're being filmed and photographed so that their pimps and traffickers can make more money. They're trying to make more money here. So they're filming and photographing, or the buyers are, and they're uploading it to these pornography websites too. It's, as you said, it's more advertising, it's more revenue. There's no difference between these industries anymore.
on that point, do you ever think that it's possible for pornography to be produced in an ethical or non-exploitive way? I think very quickly, we've been able to list a couple of different examples of obviously unethical and obviously exploitive production of pornography.
Mm-hmm.
But I know some people might ask, well, could it be done a right way? Is there just, some way that's warm and fuzzy and consensual that we should be pursuing, or is all of it harmful?
Well, okay, so two ways I want to answer, points I want to touch on is one, there is no ethical pornography. There's like a genre that uses that term, but when you look at how it's being filmed, what the content is, what the types of acts are, it's the same. It's degradation, abuse, violence, largely of other human beings. And no, that's not ethical. And they might be claiming, oh, this is made by a woman, so it's nicer. But largely, when you start digging, it's still like super run by men, the whole industry. And they're trying to reach the demand that's driven by men. Of course, yes, women are watching pornography increasingly too. But no, it isn't. There's nothing made ethically right now. And I don't believe that it will be possible in the future. And if you just think about, how can individuals in pornography who are being depicted truly consent to what's being done to them? Are those who are being filmed, do they have a big picture of what is going to happen to them in the future, what it's going to mean to have this abuse recorded and distributed, innumerable times in the future? What are they truly consenting to that? Are they consenting? Are they fully informed of the physical, mental, psychological impacts that performing in pornography does? And it's not even performing, because actually when somebody is hit in pornography, they're actually really hit. They're not pretending or acting. And the harm that it has on their mental state, their physical state, is immense for years to come. Are they truly fully consenting to that? I'd say no. Nobody has figured out a way to have true, authentic, full consent. And so there's my answer on that side. But then also there's the impact that the pornography has on the user. Can it be ethical? The impact is having on the user? No. I mean, we could get into the research here about the immense amount of studies on the brain. I think there's something like 43 studies just in the last 10 years or so about the neurological impacts pornography has had on the brain. They're consistent with about 300 other studies about the role the internet addiction has on the brain. And it's causing structural changes. And then there's studies about self-esteem, how interpersonal relationships, your view on equality between the sexes, your likelihood to act out in an sexually aggressive way, or to be acted out upon. Like, how can pornography even be ethical to consume on the consumer? So the answer is no, Haley.
I think it also, in addition to that, we see that at scale, on an institutional level, no pornography company has come up with a legitimate way to verify age and consent. And I think that that's just worth pointing out, because I think people assume, well, why wouldn't it be ethical if two people are signing a contract? And they don't realize how, unfortunately, frequently someone will not realize everything that is going to be required of them, that something more brutal or degrading is introduced partway through filming, and someone can't say no and stop, because then they might lose, they've already gone through a certain amount of the scene, and then they might not be paid at the end. And all of the just harms also of like commercialization and the competitive marketplace that makes it so people have this real incentive to say yes, even to acts that they aren't comfortable with, because otherwise they might not be able to be paid at the end. So I just think it's also interesting to note that, because I think people don't always understand the pornography industry as it stands right now, and they assume that two people signing a contract means that it's completely verified of their age and consent, and they don't realize that people have been and are even sex trafficked into mainstream pornography production, as we recently saw in the Girls Do Porn case. I think it was some 40 women were plied with alcohol and drugs and coerced into signing contracts even to produce this content. So I think, people maybe have a bit more of a rosy idea of just the nuts and bolts of how this stuff works. It's not all clear cut. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have so many more stories and examples of that too. Just really briefly, I've talked to about 200 survivors of the porn industry specifically, and some are still in the industry, some have left, some advocate against it, some want to stay in the shadows. And through their experiences that they've shared with me, I think every single one of them, I wasn't keeping like exact research type notes, but I think every single one of them shared stories of coercion and fraud and force within the industry. And part of the problem too is it's after this abuse happens to you, after you're degraded and belittled and shamed and told nobody will care about you, which is what so many of the producers, even the police, will say and do when a victim is raped on a porn set and then goes to get help. They keep going on because they feel like there's nothing else that they can do about it. They feel powerless often. And so can pornography be ethical? Well, it 100% isn't. There's nothing that's ethical that exists now. So
a bit of a similar vein of thought is maybe turning from pornography to the idea of prostitution. And some people, especially online, especially on Twitter, people will say that they're freely consenting to prostitution, and so they should be kind of left to that choice. What's your response to that?
Well, when you step back and look at the research, and again, I've talked with more hundreds, many survivors of prostitution over the years. It's not those who are claiming that it's truly consenting and somehow empowering for them to engage in prostitution. Those who are vocal and have a platform do not represent the majority of individuals in the prostitution marketplace. The majority of those who are being prostituted, they don't have a voice. Nobody's listening to them, and they experience immense harm, immense physical harm, immense mental harm, and impacts that last largely a lifetime. Even those who are claiming that it's empowering to them are experiencing immense harm physically and mentally and emotionally. And so I'm here to represent those who aren't given that platform. Also, okay, maybe some are consenting, but so many more aren't. And they should have other choices. Should they have to engage in prostitution because they can't pay their rent or because they can't put food on the table for their kids? No, that's not good enough for those people. Should they have to engage in prostitution because they're trans and were kicked out of their home and can't get a job? No, they shouldn't be forced into selling themselves and experiencing that lifelong trauma. Our country, the world needs to do better. And prostitution, that's not the choice that we should be giving them. That's not the job we should be forcing on people.
Yeah, I think there was a study that was done that said 89% of the people surveyed who were in prostitution said that they wanted to leave, but they just didn't know what their alternatives could be. And that always to me seemed like that, well, that's not a true choice then. So many times it's people who've faced multiple layers of social or economic disadvantage. And yeah, we should be doing better for them as a society, not relegating. I've also heard people say, well, poor people should have prostitution to rely on. I don't think prostitution should be this social safety net where then we're saying we're okay with a society where the wealthy and powerful buy access to the poor people's bodies, like, and to use them for sex just based on where they stand in the hierarchy, I think that's very offensive to me at least.
Haley, I agree with you. I want to add, you just made a comment that, you know, the thing that the National Center on Sexual Exploitation is advocating for is that we make those on-ramps into the exploitation industry, whether it's porn or prostitution, smaller, making it harder for individuals to be pushed in to that marketplace, whether it's changes to online social media platforms where predators are rampantly trying to target kids to bring them into the industry, or making sure that there's improved social safety nets for the most vulnerable. So we're trying to decrease the on-ramps, the size of the on-ramps, and then increase the off-ramps. So we want more services, more strategies, more ways that individuals who are being exploited can exit that industry. So we're advocating for things like, you know, corporations being willing and able to hire and provide jobs to those who are being exploited, training, housing, money, social services. A lot of for example, we talked a little bit about sex buyers and how they need to have more accountability. Well, we're working to make sure that laws are passed with stricter penalties on those who are buying, with fines to go to pay for the exit services that those who are being exploited need in order to exit the industry. So I just want to tie, like, we've talked a lot about the harm, and so what are we doing about it? Well, that's a good summary of what we're trying to do about it.
And what would you say for those who say that prostitution is necessary for financial survival? I guess I already said I find that an offensive question personally, but it's a real question in many ways, you know. It's a real question because especially in the time of COVID, many people are struggling financially and they're maybe thinking that the sex trade is their only option. What are your thoughts on that?
I would say talk to many who have exited and understand the realities that it causes immense trauma that lasts mostly your whole life. And is that the answer? And do you have another choice? Now, I think what's most critical and what I'm fighting so hard to change is that the shame and the segregation and the judgment of those who are exploited has to change in society. You know, I think that in some regards, that shame and judgment needs to be targeted to the buyers and the traffickers and pimps. Those who are being exploited need love, they need support, they need assistance, so that's not their only financial solution.
Some critics might say that Nekozi is against people in the sex trade because of our position that is trying to argue about the harms of pornography and prostitution and decrease those on-ramps. So is that true? Do you think, is Nekozi against sex workers or against people in the sex trade?
Well, I have to say, I hate that term sex worker because they're trying to normalize what's happening to them. It's not sex and it's not work. Hashtag sex work is neither. And so I have to highlight that, but absolutely not. We're not against them at all. Everything we're advocating for is for them also. And for those future victims who will be pushed into the sex trade if we don't do something about it to decrease and shrink it. So I understand how the pimp lobby, the pornographers have tried to frame us as being against those who they exploit and they abuse and they degrade. But that's frankly just the biggest lie that's out there.
And so no, Nekozi does not do really direct services, doesn't run a shelter, doesn't, give scholarships necessarily to survivors. How does Nekozi help survivors from the sex trade or other forms of exploitation?
Nekozi does give some scholarships. We have a fund, and we provide a lot of training and networking and legal services, connecting them to legal services. So in that way, we provide direct services. But that's true. We're not really on the ground doing outreach and the day-to-day, serving the day-to-day needs, but we interact with many lived experience experts. So we invite survivors to inform and help with all of our advocacy, whether it's corporate or legislative work. All of our advocacy is informed by them. And we're advocating for solutions that survivors have told us are needed. For example, it was a group of, Haley, you were with me. It was a group of like 3 young survivors of trafficking, the oldest being 14 years old, who we met with in DC, who told us they were trafficked. They were targeted, groomed, and sold on Instagram platform. And they wanted us to know how it was happening so that we could go to Instagram and then Snapchat and TikTok and Twitter to change the way that predators were targeting and grooming and selling. And so we did. And the best news is that those platforms made massive changes to decrease the ease with which people can target young kids for prostitution. But so all of our policy is informed and often spurred initially by survivors. Also, all of our policy, most of our policy work is advocating for services, for more resources for survivors, more funding for the direct service providers locally. That's our role. The direct service providers usually can't be involved in the policy work. It's a partnership that our movement needs, and that we've seen incredible success from. They don't have time to be at their state capital or at the federal level saying, we need money for this, because they're working so hard. They're available 24/7. And so that's what we do for them.
Tell us more about the law center as well, because I always think about that as a way that there's some direct assistance to survivors as well.
Well, fairly recently, I think a lot of people don't realize this about us, but we started a law center to be really active in our courts and legislatures. And the number one goal of the law center is to represent survivors of sexual abuse and exploitation as they seek for justice and an ounce of justice and accountability for the big systems that helped in their exploitation. So we've began filing lawsuits on behalf of survivors as they seek restitution from companies like Pornhub or Twitter, or even the state of Nevada, who has basically sanctioned sex trafficking in their state and prostitution. Even though it's only counties, the whole industry has exploded there because of their backwards policy. So that's a really big way that we're serving survivors, is we're representing them in the courts, and we're helping to equip a whole movement of plaintiffs' attorneys to represent survivors in an ethical and meaningful way.
How can people get involved with Nekozi? Maybe someone's listening to this and they're hearing about such a wide number of things that are going on, ways that we're working in the world, and they want to be like you 13 years ago, and they want to get involved with an organization on these issues. What advice would you have for people?
Well, I first say, stand up against exploitation wherever and whenever you see it. And I know it's uncomfortable. Believe me, I know how uncomfortable it is, but I'm telling you, almost more than 50% of the time, I'd say 80% of the time, as you raise your voice when you see it, you win, and you bring more people to your cause, and you realize you're not alone, and the world changes and the world becomes better. And more concretely, I'd say, join us. We have so many actions. The National Center on Sexual Exploitation is not just about talking about these issues and educating. We're about action and change. And I think at any given time, we have about 70 actions you could take right from home, like from your smartphone. It takes you just like a minute or less against, for legislation, on the legal side, for public communications on social media, or corporate advocacy. So join us. We need a bigger army. We have swelled in recent years, and just recognize that you're not alone, and it doesn't matter what religious or political background you come from, you have a home here with us.
I definitely encourage everyone to do that. And I'll make sure to put our website, which is endsexualexploitation.org, in the notes here, wherever you're watching or listening, so that you can get plugged in as quickly as possible. My last question for you, Dawn, but of course, if you have any other parting thoughts, feel free to add them, is as the new CEO, what's your vision for the future of this organization or this coalition and really this movement that you're leading?
Well, I believe that we can truly create a world free from sexual abuse and exploitation. And that as we work together, we can create a world where people can thrive, where they can love, where they can pursue dreams and happiness, and they can thrive. And so that really is my vision. And I think putting aside whatever differences we might have so that that's a reality is truly possible. I will say there's 3 kind of big areas of concentration for Nekozi right now. The first one is that we're working to destabilize the pornography industry and make pornography intolerable in society. I said it, guys. Somehow the pornography industry is trying to say, look, this is their motive. Yes, it is our motive. We want to destabilize the pornography industry and make pornography intolerable in society, much like the tobacco industry happened, so that people can make an informed decision about whether they want to consume this harmful material or not, or participate in it. Our other immediate goal is to stop sex buying and to end sex trafficking and all exploitation. If there were no buyers, there would be no business. And so that's kind of where we're going with that. And then our third objective right now immediately is to protect children online, is to have more accountability for tech so that they built such incredible systems and platforms, but they built them without thinking of the kids that are using them at all. And so a lot of our kids are being harmed, and they're finding themselves in the marketplace that we've been talking about. And so creating safer spaces online for kids, where our social media companies in particular are thinking through the way that they build their platforms so that it's safer for the young and more vulnerable users. So join me.
You heard her, people. If you're inspired by this vision, check us out at endsexualexploitation.org, and so many ways for you to get involved and be a part of this movement. Thank you so much, Dawn, for taking the time to share more with us, and I'm sure we'll have you back on before long to chat about more victories that are being accomplished.
Bye.